The stars do not care for the living. They burn in silence, separated by distances that mock the ambitions of empire, and they will continue burning long after the last fleet has scattered to ash and the last voice has spoken its final word into the void. I have watched them for 400 years now, not as a poet watches, seeking meaning, but as one watches a wound that refuses to heal. They are beautiful. They are indifferent.
And somewhere among them, in a spiral arm we had dismissed as unremarkable, a species we had judged barely worth cataloging, was listening. "My name is Kalath Sorvani, and I was once the third arbiter of the conclave of eternal stars, keeper of treaties signed before humanity's ancestors had learned to chip stone into tools. I held authority over 17 systems and spoke with the voice of a civilization that had mapped the birth and death of galaxies. I was old even by our standards, my shell weathered by centuries, my eyes dimmed by the light of suns that no longer existed. I had seen empires rise on the bones of their predecessors and fall into the same forgotten silence. I believed, with the certainty of the ancient, that I understood the shape of the universe. I understood nothing. The signal was sent 1,200 years ago, before the conclave had consolidated its power, before the great silence had descended upon the outer territories like a shroud. It was a cry for help, broadcast on every frequency our ancestors could generate, aimed at every corner of the galaxy that might hold intelligent life. The message was simple. We are here. We are dying. Please respond. The civilizations that heard it, and there were many we learned later, made their calculations and found the mathematics unfavorable. The Vorathi Dominion determined that intervention would require resources better spent on their own expansion. The crystalline minds of Sector 12 concluded that the probability of meaningful reciprocation was too low to justify the risk. The hegemony of the burning path saw only weakness and marked the coordinates for future conquest. And the conclave, my conclave, debated for 3 generations before issuing its formal response: regretful non-engagement due to insufficient strategic value. We forgot about them. We all forgot about them. The signal faded into the archives, a footnote in the endless cataloging of voices crying out into the dark. And life continued, as it always does, until suddenly it couldn't anymore. I remember the day the war truly began, though began is perhaps too gentle a word. Wars begin with declarations, with borders crossed and ultimatums delivered. What came for us was not a war. It was an erasure. The Veth emerged from the spaces between stars where our sensors could not reach, from the gravitational shadows of dying suns, from the quantum foam of reality itself. They did not communicate. They did not demand surrender. They simply appeared, in numbers that defied our projections, and they began to consume. Not to conquer. Consumption was too purposeful a word for what they did. They unmade. Worlds that had stood for 1,000,000 years dissolved into clouds of particulate matter. Fleets that had patrolled the same routes for centuries vanished between one heartbeat and the next, leaving only the fading echoes of distress signals that no one could answer. The first system to fall was Korvath Prime, jewel of the inner territories, home to 9 billion souls and the greatest libraries in the known universe. It took the Veth 16 hours. 16 hours to reduce a civilization's proudest achievement to an expanding shell of cooling debris. I watched the final transmissions from my chamber on Sentinel Station, watched the sky fill with shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process, watched the planetary shields fail in cascading sequences that our engineers had sworn were impossible. The last transmission from the surface was from a child. She was asking for her mother. I have not slept well since. In the cycles that followed, we learned the true scope of our peril. The Veth were not a civilization in any sense we understood. They were a process, a hunger that had awakened in the galactic core and was now spreading outward with the patience of entropy itself. They could not be negotiated with because they did not negotiate. They could not be reasoned with because reason implied goals, and the Veth had no goals we could discern. They simply ended things. That was their nature. That was their function. The Varathi Dominion fell in 3 months. Their war fleets, the terror of 100 systems, managed to slow the advance by exactly 11 days before being swept aside like leaves before a hurricane. The crystalline minds attempted to communicate using every mathematical framework in their vast archives and received no response but annihilation. The hegemony of the burning path, those arrogant conquerors who had never known defeat, broke against the Veth like waves against a shore, and were erased so completely that we still do not know how many worlds they lost. And the Conclave, my beloved Conclave, discovered that 400,000 years of accumulated wisdom meant nothing against an enemy that did not care about wisdom. I was on the bridge of the endless resolve when we received word that the inner systems had voted for dissolution. Not surrender. The Veth would not have accepted surrender even if we had known how to offer it. Dissolution. A formal acknowledgement that the conclave of eternal stars had failed in its sacred duty to protect the peoples under its care, that our ancient treaties and carefully balanced power structures had become as meaningless as the dust between galaxies. We were to scatter, to flee, to preserve what fragments of our culture we could in the hope that someday, somewhere, someone might find them and remember that we had existed. It was during the Great Scattering that I first heard about the humans again. Commander Thessa brought me the report herself, her normally composed features tight with something I could not immediately identify. She was young by our standards, barely a century old, but she had proven herself in a dozen engagements, and I trusted her judgment as I trusted few others. "Third Arbiter," she said, and her voice carried an unusual quality I could not name. "We have received a response to the ancient signal." I stared at her for a long moment, certain I had misheard. "The signal was sent 1,200 years ago, Commander. What response could possibly—" "They received it," she said. "The humans received it, and they are responding now. They are asking if we still need help." I laughed. It was not a pleasant sound, more a bark of exhausted disbelief than anything resembling humor. The humans? The primitive species from that unremarkable system in the outer spiral arm? The ones our surveys indicated were barely capable of leaving their own planet. Those humans? "The same, Arbiter. Although—" She hesitated, and I saw the unnamed emotion in her eyes again. It looked almost like uncertainty, but that made no sense. Thessa was never uncertain. "Our information about them may not be entirely current." "Not current. Our last survey was conducted." I paused, consulting my neural archives. 300 years ago. Standard interval for pre-spacefaring civilizations." "Yes, Arbiter. And in those 300 years it appears they have changed." I did not understand then what she was trying to tell me. I would not understand for some time, but something in her voice made me agree to redirect our course toward the coordinates they had provided. We had nothing left to lose, after all. The Veth were perhaps 6 months behind us, consuming everything in their path with the same terrible patience. If the humans could offer us shelter, even temporarily, it was worth the detour. We had been fleeing for so long. Even a few days of rest would be worth almost anything. The journey took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of jumping between systems that had once belonged to powers now extinct, of watching the distant light of Veth expansion creeping ever closer on our long-range sensors. 3 weeks of rationing supplies and repairing damage and conducting memorial services for the ships that had not survived the last transit. By the time we entered the system the humans called Sol, we were down to 47 vessels from an original fleet of 212, carrying approximately 18,000 refugees from a civilization that had once numbered in the trillions. That was all that remained of the conclave of eternal stars. 47 ships and 18,000 frightened souls. I expected to find a primitive system, a single inhabited world, perhaps, with a few scattered outposts on nearby moons. Radio transmissions and chemical propulsion, and all the awkward first steps of a species just learning to walk among the stars. What I found instead made me question whether my long-range sensors had malfunctioned. The system was alive. Ships moved everywhere, thousands of them, tens of thousands, in sizes ranging from small personal craft to vessels that dwarfed even the endless Resolve. They traveled between orbital platforms that ringed every planet and major moon, between asteroid mining facilities that seemed to have consumed entire debris fields, between stations of such scale that they registered as small moons on our instruments. And beyond the system's edge, at the very limit of our detection range, I could see the framework of something so vast that my mind initially refused to process it. "Third Arbiter," Thessa said, her voice carefully controlled, "I am reading artificial structures extending approximately 3 light minutes in every direction from the central star. Power signatures are... I do not have a reference frame for these readings. They exceed anything in our databases by several orders of magnitude." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. A communication request arrived before we had crossed the system's outer boundary. The signal was clean, powerful, and precisely calibrated to our communication frequencies we had not shared with anyone. "Attention conclave vessels," the voice said in perfect, unaccented conclave standard. "This is Sol System Traffic Control. We have you on our screens and are transmitting approach vectors for your fleet. Medical and support teams are standing by. Please reduce speed and follow the indicated route. And welcome, we're glad you made it." I found my voice, though it sounded strange in my own ears. "This is Third Arbiter Calith Sorvani of the Conclave of Eternal Stars. We thank you for your welcome. We did not expect this." A pause. Then, with what I would later learn to recognize as characteristic human understatement, "Yeah, we've been busy. Try to get some rest during the approach. You look like you could use it." The approach took 7 hours at the speed they had assigned us. 7 hours of traveling through a system so heavily developed that I could not find a single region of space that was not in active use. Thessa compiled data throughout the journey, her reports growing progressively more subdued as the numbers accumulated. population estimates in the tens of billions across the system, industrial output that exceeded the Conclave's pre-war capacity by a factor of 6. Scientific installations conducting experiments with energies that our theoretical models had deemed impossible to harness for another 10,000 years. 300 years. They had done all of this in 300 years. The station where they directed us was called Lighthouse. It hung in orbit above their third planet, a red world they were in the process of transforming into something habitable, and it was designed, they explained, specifically to receive refugee populations. The docking bays were large enough to accommodate our entire fleet with room to spare. The corridors were sized for species far larger than humans. The atmosphere generators could produce any chemical mixture required. They had prepared for guests they had never met, from civilizations they had never contacted, against a day they had somehow known would come. I met the station commander in a receiving bay that seemed designed to put nervous aliens at ease. The gravity had been adjusted to match Conclave standard. The lighting was soft, the colors muted. There were no visible weapons, no aggressive displays, nothing that might trigger a threat response in species they had never encountered. Everything was calm. Everything was thoughtful. Everything was terrifying in its quiet competence. Her name was Commander Sarah Chen, and she was smaller than I had expected. Humans, I had learned from our old surveys, were not an imposing species physically. They had no natural weapons, no armored hides, no exceptional strength or speed. Commander Chen was perhaps 1.5 meters tall, slightly built, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She wore a simple uniform with no decorations I could identify. When she smiled, it reached those dark eyes and made them seem almost warm. "Third Arbiter Sorvani," she said, and her pronunciation of my name was flawless. "I've read about your service, the Treaty of 17 Suns, the preservation of the outer libraries, the mercy of Corvath Prime. You've spent your life trying to protect people. I want you to know that here, that matters to us." I found myself momentarily unable to speak. It had been a very long time since anyone had spoken to me with such simple, direct respect. "You know our history," I finally managed. "We've been listening for a long time," she said. "We had a lot of catching up to do. Please, sit. Your people are being processed now. Medical evaluation, shelter assignment, nutrient synthesis calibration. Everything they need to feel safe for the first time in months. But I thought you and I should talk." There were chairs in the room that matched our physiology almost exactly. I sank into one, suddenly aware of how exhausted I truly was. Chen took a seat across from me, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes never leaving my face. "You have questions," she said. It was not a question. "I have many questions, Commander, but the most pressing is also the most obvious. How? How did you accomplish all of this? Our surveys indicated that 300 years ago you had barely achieved consistent spaceflight within your own system. Now you appear to have surpassed civilizations that have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. It should not be possible." Chen was quiet for a moment, and something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a softness that might have been sadness or might have been something else entirely. "Do you know what we were doing when your surveys were conducted, Arbiter, 300 years ago?" "Your records indicated internecine conflict, resource disputes, environmental degradation, the typical pattern for pre-unified species." "Yes," she said. "We were busy killing each other. We were very good at it, actually. We'd had a lot of practice. But then your signal arrived." I felt something cold settle in my chest. You received the signal 300 years ago? Our records indicated... Your records indicated what your surveys observed, which was a species that appeared primitive and divided. What your surveys did not detect was that we had been working on a unified monitoring system, a network of radio telescopes spanning our entire planet. We were searching for signs of intelligent life, you see. We had been searching for a very long time, hoping we were not alone in the universe. She paused. We found your signal on the 4th day of the network's operation. A cry for help, broadcast on every frequency, from a civilization facing extinction. And beneath it, embedded in the carrier wave, the responses from all the species who had chosen not to help.
The cold in my chest intensified. You decoded the refusal logs?
We decoded everything, Arbiter. We learned that there was life throughout the galaxy, ancient, powerful, vast, beyond our comprehension. We learned that these great civilizations had received a plea for help from a dying people, and had done the mathematics and decided it wasn't worth their trouble. And we learned something about the universe that your ancient species had apparently forgotten. What did you learn?
Chen leaned forward, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that made me want to look away. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something older and colder, something that had been carefully controlled but never extinguished.
We learned that the universe is full of beings who will watch you die rather than risk themselves to help. And we decided, all of us, together, in a way we had never managed to decide anything before, that we would not be one of them. That if we ever had the power to answer a call for help, we would answer it, no matter the cost, no matter the risk, no matter what.
She sat back, and the intensity faded, replaced by that same soft, terrible calm.
That's how, Arbiter. That's how we accomplished all of this. Your signal united us. Your signal showed us what we did not want to become. And for 300 years, every single day, we have been preparing for the moment when someone else would send a signal like that, when someone else would cry out for help into the darkness. We never expected it would be the same people calling. I sat in silence for a long time after that, processing implications that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. The humans had heard our ancient cry for help. They had witnessed the galaxy's indifference, and rather than accept that indifference as the natural order, rather than harden themselves against the suffering of others as every other species had done, they had done the opposite. They had made our abandonment into a founding purpose. They had built their entire civilization around the principle that no one should ever be left to die alone in the dark. It was, I realized, either the most noble thing I had ever encountered or the most terrifying.
The Veth, I said finally. You know about the Veth?
We know, Chen said. We've been watching them for some time now. We've been watching everything, actually. Our sensor networks extend considerably farther than most species realize. Then you understand what is coming, what will reach this system in a matter of months if nothing is done to stop it.
Yes, and you are not afraid?
Chen smiled, and there was something ancient in that smile, something that belonged to a species that had clawed its way up from prey animals on a world that seemed designed to kill them. Arbiter, we've been afraid since the moment we understood what the universe actually contains. Fear is familiar to us. We've learned to work with it rather than against it.
The Veth have destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than yours. The Vorathi, the crystalline mines, the hegemony, they fell in weeks. The conclave itself, 400,000 years of accumulated power, could not slow them. What makes you believe you can succeed where we all failed?
I don't believe we can succeed, Chen said quietly. I know we might fail. We might all die. That's not the point. Then what is the point? The point is that someone called for help, and we are going to answer. That's who we are now. That's who your signal made us. If we die trying to stop the Veth, at least we'll die knowing we did what none of the ancient powers were willing to do. She paused. At least we'll die being the species we wanted to be. I found I had no response to that. What could I possibly say to a species that had turned our abandonment into a reason to become better than we were? The days that followed were a blur of activity that I could barely comprehend. My people, those 18,000 frightened souls who had survived the long flight from our dying civilization, were absorbed into the human systems with an efficiency that bordered on alarming. Medical teams that had clearly studied our physiology in detail treated injuries we had not had the resources to address.
Counselors who spoke our language and understood our cultural context helped survivors process trauma that had been accumulating for months. Engineers retrofitted our damaged ships with human technology that our own technicians could not fully understand, making vessels that had been on the verge of failure capable of operations they had never been designed for. And through it all, the humans were kind. That was the word that kept returning to me, the word that I could not quite reconcile with everything else I was witnessing. They were kind in a way that felt practiced, deliberate, as if they had thought very carefully about what kindness meant and had decided to make it a discipline rather than merely an emotion. They asked about our families, our histories, the things we had lost. They listened without judgment and responded without pity. They treated us as guests rather than refugees, as people rather than problems to be managed. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made me increasingly uneasy, in ways I could not fully articulate. On the 5th day, Commander Chen invited me to observe what she called a planning session. I accepted, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I felt I owed it to my people to understand what the humans intended to do about the approaching Veth. The room she led me to was deep within the station, in a section I had not previously been permitted to access. The security measures were extensive but subtle: biometric scans, quantum encrypted locks, spaces that seemed designed to prevent any unauthorized observation or recording. When the final door opened, I found myself in a chamber that must have spanned a kilometer in every direction, filled with holographic displays showing data I could not immediately interpret. There were perhaps 50 humans in the room, seated at stations around a central projection area. They turned as we entered, and I saw in their faces the same calm, attentive expression I had seen in Chen. No fear, no bravado, just focused, deliberate purpose. Third Arbiter Sorvani has agreed to serve as an advisor for this session, Chen announced. His experience with the Veth is extensive, and his perspective will be valuable. Please make him welcome. There was a murmur of acknowledgement, and I was guided to a seat that had clearly been prepared for my physiology. The holographic displays shifted, resolving into a three-dimensional map of the local galactic region. I recognized the positions of conclave systems, or what had been conclave systems, before the Veth had consumed them. Red markers indicated the current extent of Veth expansion. At their current rate, they would reach Sol System in approximately 147 days. "Current situation assessment," Chen said, and the room fell silent. The Veth have consumed approximately 73% of the former conclave territories and are expanding at a rate of approximately 4.7 light-years per day. Refugee populations continue to arrive through the safe corridors we established, with total evacuees now exceeding 200 million individuals across 17 species. Our forward observation posts report no change in Veth behavior patterns. They continue to consume all matter in their path without apparent strategic direction or responsiveness to external stimuli. I listened, expecting the usual discussions that had characterized every conclave war council I had ever attended: resource allocations, defensive positions, evacuation priorities, the grim calculus of deciding who could be saved and who would have to be sacrificed. Instead, the human officer who rose to speak began with a sentence that made no sense to me at all.
Preliminary construction is complete on the barrier line. All 347 generator stations are now operational and have achieved synchronization to within 0.003% of target parameters.
I raised a manipulating appendage, the conclave gesture for requesting clarification. Forgive my interruption, but what is the barrier line? The room turned to look at me, and I saw something in their expressions. Not quite surprise, not quite pity, but something adjacent to both. Chen nodded slightly, and the holographic display shifted again. What I saw defied my understanding of physics. The display showed a curved line extending across nearly 60 light-years of space, positioned between the advancing Veth and the Sol system. Along this line, at precisely calculated intervals, were structures that registered as larger than most moons. They were identical in design, each one a complex arrangement of focusing arrays and power conduits and dimensional anchors that my education told me should not be possible to construct. The barrier line, Chen explained, is a linked network of spatial disruption generators capable of creating a sustained fold in local spacetime. When activated, it will create a region approximately 4 light-years deep where conventional transit is impossible. Anything crossing that barrier will be subjected to gravitational shearing forces that exceed the structural integrity of any known matter. I stared at the display, struggling to process what I was hearing. You have built a wall across 60 light-years of space. 347 coordinated stations, yes. Construction began approximately 40 years ago when our long-range monitoring first detected the Veth emergence. We've been building it continuously since then, adjusting the position as we refined our predictions of the Veth expansion pattern.
40 years ago, I repeated. You detected the Veth 40 years ago.
37 years before they made contact with the first conclave system, yes. We tried to warn the conclave through intermediary channels, but our communications were not taken seriously. We were still classified as a primitive species in your databases, as I understand it. Your information protocols did not allow for the possibility that we might have developed relevant intelligence capabilities. Something twisted in my chest, something that might have been shame or might have been fear. You knew they were coming and you tried to warn us and we did not listen. You couldn't have known, Chen said, and her voice was gentle in a way that made the words hurt more. Your surveys told you we were primitive. Your experience told you that primitive species don't develop faster than light detection capabilities. You made reasonable assumptions based on the information available to you. The failure was in the information, not the judgment. It was a kindness, I realized. She was offering me a kindness, giving me an excuse I did not deserve. The conclave had dismissed human warnings because we had been too arrogant to imagine that a younger species might see something we had missed. We had let billions die because we could not conceive of the possibility that we might be wrong. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound like the empty justifications of a broken old fool. The briefing continued. I listened as the humans discussed deployment schedules, energy calculations, contingency plans for various failure scenarios. Their coordination was remarkable. Each specialist speaking with precision, each department anticipating the needs of others, the entire operation moving like a single organism with countless interconnected parts. But it was not their efficiency that disturbed me most. It was their scale. The barrier line was only the beginning. Behind it, the humans were constructing a secondary network of weapons platforms, not defensive but offensive, designed to engage anything that managed to penetrate the barrier. These platforms utilized energy systems I did not recognize, drawing power from sources that the briefing officers described only as deep infrastructure. When I asked for clarification, Chen explained that the humans had been harvesting energy from their star for the past century, using collection systems that encircled it in a lattice of impossible complexity. They had built a structure around their sun. They had turned their star into a power source, and they had done it so quietly, so efficiently, that no one in the galaxy had noticed. The third phase, another officer announced, involves the deployment of the response fleet. Current readiness stands at 97%, with all major vessels now positioned at staging areas throughout the outer system. Full deployment capability will be achieved within the next 72 hours. I found my voice again, though it sounded strange even to my own ears. How large is the response fleet? A pause. The officer looked at Chen, who nodded slightly. The response fleet currently consists of approximately 14,000 combat-capable vessels, supported by 86,000 auxiliary and support craft. Total personnel complement is approximately 27 million individuals. The numbers echoed in my mind, refusing to resolve into meaning. 14,000 combat vessels. The Conclave, at the height of its power, had maintained perhaps 2,000 military-grade ships across all of its 17 systems. The humans had built 7 times that number, in 300 years, without anyone noticing. "Arbiter," Chen said quietly, and I realized I had been silent for too long. "I understand this is a lot to process. Would you like to take a break?" "No. I managed. No, I need to understand this. I need to understand what you are, because I do not believe that what I am witnessing is possible." Chen was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle. "Do you know what happened to us, Arbiter? After we received your signal, after we learned that the universe was full of ancient powers who would rather watch a species die than risk themselves to help?" "You unified," I said. "You told me this. The signal brought you together." "The signal started the process, but what really unified us was what came after. The fear. The understanding that we were tiny and alone, and that no one was coming to save us if we were ever in danger. We looked at the stars and saw a universe of predators and cowards, and we realized that if we were going to survive, we would have to become something the universe had never seen before. A pause, something that even ancient civilizations would fear to threaten. And so you built this. All of this." "We built everything we could imagine, and then we imagined more and built that too. For 300 years, Arbiter, every single human has woken up every single day knowing that somewhere out there, something might be coming to destroy us. We have lived with that fear our entire lives. Our parents lived with it. Our grandparents lived with it. It has shaped everything about us, our politics, our economics, our science, our philosophy. We became a species defined by preparation, by readiness, by the absolute determination that when the day came, when someone called for help, or when something came to threaten our existence, we would be ready. She gestured at the displays surrounding us, at the impossible structures and unimaginable fleets and defenses that spanned light years. This is what fear looks like, Arbiter, when you refuse to let it paralyze you. This is what a species can accomplish when every single member is working toward a common purpose. And this is what we're going to use to stop the Veth, because 300 years ago, we decided that no one should ever have to face annihilation alone. Not even the civilizations that left us to face it ourselves. I sat in that vast chamber, surrounded by humans who had transformed their terror into purpose, and I felt something I had not felt in decades. It was not hope, exactly. Hope was too gentle a word for the emotion that gripped me. It was something raw, something more primal, a dawning recognition that I had been wrong about the shape of the universe, that everything I thought I understood about power and weakness and the nature of civilization had been fundamentally, catastrophically incorrect. The humans were not primitive. They had never been primitive. They had simply been waiting, preparing, forging themselves into an instrument of terrible, patient purpose. And now, at last, they were ready to use it. The barrier line activated on day 73, when the leading edge of Veth expansion reached its outermost perimeter. I watched from an observation platform on Lighthouse Station, surrounded by the refugees of a dozen species, as a ribbon of distorted space ignited across the darkness. It was beautiful, in the way that a storm is beautiful, power so vast that aesthetics became meaningless, scale so tremendous that the mind could not fully process it. The barrier stretched across the view screen like a wall of crystallized lightning, space itself folding and twisting in ways that defied my understanding of physics. And against it, for the first time, the Veth stopped. Not retreated, not hesitated, stopped. We watched for 17 hours as the Veth tested the barrier, probing its edges with tendrils of consuming darkness, searching for weaknesses that did not exist. For 17 hours, an enemy that had never been slowed by anything encountered something it could not immediately overcome. And in those 17 hours, I saw something I had never expected to see: confusion. The Veth were confused. They did not understand what they were encountering because nothing like it had ever existed. No civilization had ever built a weapon on this scale, with this level of coordination, with this degree of single-minded determination. The Veth had consumed beings who had existed for millions of years, but they had never encountered a species that had spent 3 centuries doing nothing but preparing for exactly this moment. They could not comprehend it. Perhaps they could not even perceive it. To them, I imagined, the barrier must have seemed like a natural feature of the universe, an inexplicable anomaly rather than a deliberate construction, because the alternative, accepting that a species they had never even noticed had built something that could stop them, was simply impossible. But it was not impossible. It was standing before them, burning with the light of a star's worth of energy, and it was holding. Commander Chen found me on the observation platform 6 hours after the barrier's activation. She looked tired. I had learned to read human exhaustion in the subtle lines around their eyes, the slight sagging of their shoulders. But there was a fierce satisfaction in her expression that I had not seen before. "It's working," she said. "Better than we projected, actually. The Vaith are expending enormous energy trying to breach the barrier, but they're not adapting. They don't seem capable of understanding what they're encountering.
And when they do understand, when they find a way through?
Chen smiled, and there was something in that smile that made me understand, finally, why her species had been so easily underestimated. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting their entire life for exactly this moment.
Then we move to Phase 2, she said, and the Veth learn what happens when you try to consume a species that refuses to be consumed.
Phase 2 began on day 91, when the Veth finally managed to breach the barrier at a point near its central axis. They had spent 18 days gathering themselves, concentrating their mass into a dense formation that could punch through the distorted space in a way their diffuse expansion could not. It was the first time anyone had observed them behaving strategically, and the human analysts I spoke with seemed genuinely pleased by this development.
"It means they can learn," one of them explained. "It means they're not just a force of nature. If they can learn, they can make mistakes, and if they can make mistakes, we can exploit them."
The breach lasted approximately 4 minutes before the humans sealed it. In those 4 minutes, a tendril of Veth matter, perhaps 3,000 kilometers in length, extended through the barrier and entered the defended space beyond. It was the first time Veth had crossed the barrier line. It was also the last. The weapons platforms that the humans had positioned behind the barrier were not designed for extended combat. They were designed for a single purpose: concentrated destruction. When they fired, all 47,000 of them simultaneously at the single point where the Veth had breached, the resulting energy discharge was briefly brighter than the sun.
The Veth tendril ceased to exist, not retreated, not dispersed, ceased to exist, its matter converted to energy by focused beams that operated on principles our science did not yet understand. The breach was sealed, the barrier remained intact, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, the main mass of the Veth had just learned something that no prey species had ever taught it before.
Fighting back was possible.
In the days that followed, I watched the humans implement what they called active suppression tactics. This was, I learned, a characteristically understated term for what amounted to a systematic counterattack against an enemy that had never been attacked before. Small, fast vessels, probes, the humans called them, though they carried enough firepower to crack a small moon, passed through carefully controlled breaches in the barrier and struck at the Veth concentration points. They did not aim to destroy the Veth. They aimed to fragment them, to break their newly discovered strategic cohesion, to force them back into the diffuse expansion patterns that were easier to contain. It was working. Slowly, painfully, with losses that the humans noted with quiet grief and then moved past, it was working. The Veneth expansion rate slowed. Then it stopped. Then, for the first time in recorded history, it began to reverse. I found Commander Chen on the bridge of the Endless Resolve, our ship, which the humans had repaired and upgraded until it barely resembled the vessel that had limped into their system weeks before. She was standing at a view screen, watching the distant flickers of weapons fire that marked the current front line.
"You're winning," I said.
"We're holding," she corrected. "Winning will take time. The Veth are vast. They've consumed the mass of hundreds of star systems. We can't destroy that much matter, but we can fragment it, disperse it, break the cohesion that lets them act as a single entity. It will take years, probably, decades maybe, but we have decades. We've been preparing for 3 centuries. We can prepare for a few more."
And the civilizations they consumed? The trillions of beings who were lost?
Chen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "Gone, Arbiter. They're gone.
We can't undo that. All we can do is make sure it doesn't happen again. All we can do is make sure that the next time someone calls for help, someone answers.
I watched her profile in the light of distant battle, this small, fragile-looking being from a species I had dismissed as primitive, and I felt the last vestiges of my old certainties crumble away.
Why? I asked. Why do any of this? You owe us nothing. We abandoned you. We ignored your warnings. We treated you as beneath our notice for centuries. Why risk everything to save people who treated you with such contempt?
Chen turned to look at me, and in her eyes I saw something I had not expected to see. It was not anger, not righteousness, not the vindication of a species proving its worth to those who had doubted them. It was something simpler and more terrible than any of those things.
It was understanding.
Because we remember what it was like, she said, calling out for help and hearing nothing, knowing that no one was coming, that we were alone, that the universe didn't care whether we lived or died. We remember that feeling, Arbiter. Every human alive remembers it because we've passed it down through generations. It's in our stories, our songs, our prayers. The silence, the abandonment, the terrible knowledge that we were utterly, completely alone.
She paused, and when she continued, her voice was even softer.
We could have become bitter. We could have decided that since no one helped us, we wouldn't help anyone else. We could have hoarded our power and waited for the universe to pay for its indifference. A lot of species might have done that. A lot of species probably have. But that's not who we decided to be. We decided that the universe's indifference was not a law, it was a choice that others had made, and a choice we could make differently. So we did.
We chose to be the species that answers. We chose to be the voice in the darkness that says, "We heard you, and we're coming."
She smiled, and it was the saddest, most beautiful expression I had ever seen on any face.
That's why, Arbiter. Not because you deserve it, not because you earned it, simply because you asked, and we were there to hear, and we will not let anyone face the dark alone, not ever again. I stood there, in the ruins of everything I had believed about power and civilization and the natural order of the universe, and I felt tears on my face for the first time in centuries. Not tears of grief, though there was grief in them. Not tears of gratitude, though there was gratitude too. They were tears of humility, the profound, shaking humility of realizing that a species I had dismissed as primitive had achieved something that 400,000 years of conclave wisdom had never even attempted. They had looked into the vast, cold indifference of the universe and chosen to be warm. The war against the Veth continued for another 11 years. I remained on Lighthouse Station for most of that time, serving as an advisor and liaison for the other refugee species. It was strange work, helping to coordinate civilizations that had once looked down on humans, who now looked up at them with the same mixture of awe and terror that I had felt in those first days. Strange, but satisfying in its way. I was too old to fight, too damaged by centuries of compromise and calculation to be of much use in the actual conflict. But I could help others understand what I had come to understand about these extraordinary beings who had saved us all. I could help them see the miracle.
Commander Chen became Admiral Chen, then Fleet Commander Chen, then finally First Speaker Chen when the humans formed their new governing structure. She remained, throughout it all, the same quietly competent person I had first met in that receiving bay, kind, thoughtful, unyielding.
When the last Veth concentration was dispersed in the outer reaches of what had once been Varathi space, she was the one who made the announcement.
Not as a victory speech, not as a triumphant declaration of human superiority, simply as a statement of fact. The threat had been contained, and the work of rebuilding could begin.
She invited me to stand beside her when she made that announcement. I did not deserve that honor, but I accepted it anyway. I had learned by then that humans did not give honors based on what was deserved. They gave them based on what was meaningful. And my presence there meant something, a representative of the old order, standing beside the leader of the new, acknowledging that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy.
Something had changed. Everything had changed. On the day of the announcement, I asked Chan a question that had haunted me for years. We were standing on a balcony overlooking the reconstruction of Sentinel Station, rebuilt now with human assistance, larger and more beautiful than before, watching the ships come and go from 100 different species.
The signal, I said. The original signal, 1,200 years ago. Do you know what it actually said? The full text, I mean, not just the summary in our archives.
Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "We are the conclave of eternal stars," she recited, and her voice took on a quality I had not heard before, almost reverent, as if she were speaking words of scripture. "We have watched the heavens for 400,000 years, and we have grown old in our watching. Now we face an enemy we cannot defeat, a darkness that consumes all in its path. We call out to any who can hear. We are dying. Please help us. Please do not leave us to face this alone. We have made mistakes, but we are not without worth. Our libraries contain the wisdom of ages. Our people have loved and created and hoped as all peoples do. Please, do not let us vanish into silence. Do not let the darkness win." She paused, and when she looked at me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We heard you, Arbiter. 1,200 years ago, you cried out into the darkness and we heard you. We were barely more than animals then, by your standards. We were killing each other over patches of ground and differences in belief. We were everything you thought we were. Primitive, divided, violent, small." A pause. "But we heard you. And something in that message, the fear, the hope, the desperate dignity of a civilization facing its end, spoke to something in us that we had almost forgotten was there. You reminded us that we were not alone in the universe, and you reminded us what it meant to ask for help and to have no one answer." She reached out and placed her small, fragile hand on my manipulating appendage. Her touch was warm. "No one answered your signal, Arbiter. No one, until we did. And we were late. 1,200 years late. We couldn't save the ones who sent that message, or the worlds they loved, or the civilization they had built. But we could remember. We could prepare. And when you called again, when the Veth came and your people sent out a new cry for help, we could finally answer." She smiled, and in that smile I saw the entire history of her species. The struggle, the fear, the determination, the unimaginable will that had transformed a frightened primitive people into something that could stand against the darkness itself. "No one responded to the signal," she said. "But we did. We did, Arbiter, and we always will." I think about that conversation often now, in my final years. I think about the humans and what they accomplished, what they became,
what they taught the rest of us about ourselves. I think about the signal that started everything, that ancient cry for help that reached across the light years and found, against all odds, ears willing to listen.
I am the last survivor of the original Conclave leadership. The others have passed on, one by one, leaving me alone with my memories and my regrets. I spend my days in a small chamber on a rebuilt world, surrounded by the works of 100 civilizations that would not exist if the humans had not answered our call. Children of species that should have been consumed by the Veth play in gardens that should have been fields of ash. Libraries that should have been annihilated contain the knowledge of ages, freely shared with all who wish to learn.
Sometimes, late at night, I look up at the stars, those ancient, indifferent fires that have watched so many civilizations rise and fall, and I remember what Chen told me on that first day. The universe is full of beings who will watch you die rather than risk themselves to help. That was true once. Perhaps it will be true again someday, when the memory of what the humans did has faded and the old indifference returns.
But for now, in this moment, it is not true. For now, there is a species in the galaxy that has chosen to be different, a species that was forged by abandonment into something that refuses to abandon, a species that looked into the cold equations of survival and decided that some things matter more than survival.
They answered the signal. No one else did, but they did.
And because of that, because of them, we are not alone anymore.
None of us are.
In the silence between stars, where the ancient powers made their cold calculations and chose to look away, a new voice speaks now. It speaks in the language of warships and barrier lines and weapons that can crack the darkness itself. But beneath those words of power, there is another message, older, simpler, more enduring than any fleet or any barrier.
We heard you. We're here. You are not alone.
That is the gift the humans gave us. That is the legacy of a species that was dismissed as primitive, ignored as irrelevant, forgotten in the archives of civilizations that believed themselves eternal. They remembered what it meant to cry out for help and hear only silence, and they decided, with all the stubborn, impossible determination that defines their kind, that no one would ever have to experience that silence again. No one responded to the signal. Until humans did, and the universe has never been the same.